Today we're going to look at the ingredients for life, or otherwise known as organic compounds. These are the things that all living things, regardless of if you're a fungus or a bacteria or a toad or a human, all living things have to have these three ingredients. They're the basic chemicals for life-sustaining functions. And so if we don't have these chemicals in the right amounts, then life cannot continue to exist. They are four compounds: proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And we call them organic compounds because they are all made of chains of carbons. So carbon is the chemical of life because all of the organic compounds are made of chains of carbon. We will start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are chemicals or molecules that include your sugars, starches, celluloses, and gums. So those things that are in your body or in the structure of living things. They are made up of only three elements: carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And so depending on the type of carbohydrate it is, depends on the arrangement of the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens. Its function is really important because this is your number one source of energy. Okay, this is how your cells get the energy that they need to do the functions that they need to do. When you eat spaghetti dinner before a basketball game or an athletic event, you are pumping your cells with carbohydrates. That's the starches that are in your noodles or your pasta, because it stores that energy so that you can have it later. That's the premise behind that. They also are a structural unit for DNA and your cell membranes, so they provide kind of a backbone for those structures. And for your brain and your nerve cells, carbohydrates are the only source of energy. Again, when you talk about people who do a no-carb diet where they're not ingesting any carbohydrates, that's not really a good thing, because you want your brain and your nerves, the only place that they get their energy is from carbohydrates. So you want to make sure that you are ingesting enough carbohydrates. Now, if you ingest too much carbohydrates, then you end up being obese, and that's not good either, but you need to have a good, happy medium. Carbohydrates are divided, if we look at the monomers and the polymers. So remember, polymers are long chains of structural units. The monomers are the individual units. So we will start with monosaccharides. These are 3 to 7 carbon chains or rings. So like if you look at this example, you can see carbon, 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 and it's arranged in a ring-like structure. And the most common monosaccharides, or the most common individual units, are glucose, galactose, fructose, and then deoxyribose. All other carbohydrates are going to be combinations of monosaccharides. So we talked about lactose at one point. Lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose. Actually, lactose is a disaccharide. It's made of two different monosaccharides. So glucose is a monosaccharide, galactose is a monosaccharide. They combine together to form a new structure, which is lactose. So all carbohydrates will be combinations of these monosaccharides, usually these four: glucose, galactose, fructose, and deoxyribose. So those are the monomers. Disaccharides are going to be when two monosaccharides are joined together. When these chemicals join together, typically water is released. And examples of disaccharides, we already talked about lactose. Maltose is another one. Sucrose is the third. Even though they're only two monosaccharides joined together, they're too big to pass through cell membranes, unlike monosaccharides, which can. So they need to be broken back down into monosaccharides in order to be put or used by the cell. So that's why we have to break apart the lactose into glucose and galactose in order for your cell to be able to take those two chemicals and use it for energy. Otherwise, the lactose is just too fat to pass through. And then next is a polysaccharide. And these are going to be really, really long chains of monosaccharides. So we talked about polymers. Polysaccharide, P-O-L-Y, it's got that same prefix to it. So long chains of monosaccharides. These are way too big to fit through any kind of cell membrane. So typically they don't even dissolve in water, they're so big. And this includes starch and glycogen, which is a source of carbohydrate that your muscles use for energy. So anything with starch in it, bread, pasta, these are really long, long chains of glucose, galactose, fructose. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is going to be a monosaccharide, and the polymer of a carbohydrate is going to be a polysaccharide. And then there's just that kind of individual disaccharide in between. So that's carbohydrates, really important for energy. Next is lipids. Examples of lipids include your fats, oils, waxes, hormones, steroids, and cholesterol. All of these things found in living things. It is made up of also three chemicals: carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, although they're arranged a little bit differently than they are in carbohydrates. The function of lipids is they make up your cell membrane. They are very important in storing energy so that you have a reserve of energy when you need it. They help with vitamin absorption. They help cushion your organs. They play an important role in temperature regulation. And they serve as chemical messengers, like in the form of hormones. They are insoluble in water, so they do not dissolve in water. And in terms of classification, there are basically two. The monomer for a lipid is going to be a fatty acid, and there are saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. And then phospholipids would be a polymer. So monomers, fatty acid, phospholipids is the polymer. Next is a nucleic acid. This is the only one of the four organic compounds that you cannot get by eating something. So nucleic acids are going to involve your genetics, and they're going to be very important in helping to make proteins. There are two types of nucleic acids found in living things. DNA, and this is a nucleic acid that's responsible for your genetics. This is what gets passed on from one generation to another. And the second is RNA, which is a chemical responsible for making your proteins. Chemically, nucleic acids are made up of carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, nitrogens, and phosphorus. The monomer for a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. And you'll see how nucleotide works when we get to the genetics unit. A long chain of nucleotide is what will make up DNA and RNA. So the monomer is called a nucleotide, Nucleotide. Sorry, I didn't put it on there. And then the polymer for a nucleic acid would be the DNA or the RNA, which is also the two different examples. And finally, proteins. Proteins are super important. All four of these ingredients you need for life, but proteins is like really, really, really important because essentially every single thing in your body structurally is made of proteins, and everything that you do or that living things do is functionally done through proteins. So they're found everywhere and they do everything. Some examples of chemicals that make up proteins include having an amine group on the end, which is a nitrogen and two hydrogens, and they also have the carboxyl group on the end, the carbon with the two oxygens and hydrogens. Proteins are made of units called amino acids. Proteins are made of repeating units called amino acids. There are 22 amino acids that are found on the planet, and the different combinations of those amino acids link together to form the long chains, which are proteins. So the protein is actually a polymer, and the amino acid is the monomer. Functions include they help build and repair your tissues. They make up enzymes, they're chemical messengers, they fight infection, and they transport oxygen. So those are the things that proteins do for living things. Classification or structure. Proteins can be arranged in a linear way, which is called a primary structure. They can be put into helixes or spirals, and this is called a secondary structure. And then there's tertiary and quaternary structures, which just means that they're folded onto themselves, which is a tertiary structure, and a quaternary function would be like more than one protein folding together or joining together with other proteins. So again, monomer for a protein is an amino acid, and a polymer is going to be the actual protein. These are the ingredients for life. So carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. For your test, you should know each of the four. You should be able to give an example of each of the four that is found in living things. You should know the chemical makeup, for sure the function of each of the four organic compounds, and then you should be able to identify or recognize the monomer and the polymer for each.